right?
It doesn't
Like
look
the
like
101st
feds.
Airborne.
Bro, look at this. These guys are all runners.
It doesn't look like feds.
Not at all. It looks like a group that wants to have a unified look, and that's why the KKK was cringe. Although also they call themselves Grand Wizard in these Dungeons and Dragons terms.
Bro, what do you
all the
think
white
these guys
supremacists are
call
gay.
each other?
This is the U.S. intelligence agency, mind control.
Passive.
Bro, you're gonna show the bombing of Baghdad, right? And let's see, you're gonna put the classical music, which is awesome to show the entire bombing of Baghdad with classical music in the background. Oh, I'm like, why is Sam Cedar still on the screen? I realized it's your background. I thought I had like some thumbnail in the corner. This is an important moment in like imperialism history, the bombing of Baghdad, right? So that's it. That bomb way off in the distance is the bomb that you're opening with you that you're going to show before you cut to this. Come on.
Pacifism is objectively pro-fascist.
Okay, Orwell. We're already starting out great here.
This is elementary common sense. If you hamper the war effort of one side, you automatically help out that of the other. Nor is there any real way of remaining outside such a war as the present one. In practice, he that is not with me is against me. You might believe that quote came from George Bush.
No,
Dick Cheney,
it came from
and
Orwell.
Wolfowitz. It sounds exactly like the kind of rhetoric they used
No, it
in the
doesn't.
build-up to the Iraq War. But actually, it's a quote from George Orwell. And what's more, it's objectively true. The context in which George Orwell came to say this was during the outbreak of the Second World War. During its first...
Yes, it was true in the context of the time, correct. But it's not true about Iraq, no.
year, a wave of pacifist sentiment swept Britain,
Yes.
with protests and town hall debates in which many figures
By that we mean people who are sympathetic to Nazis.
argued for peace with the Nazis. Orwell took it on himself to go from
See?
town hall to debate
Even
the
he
case
knows
for war with
that
Hitler.
this is a
And it
pointless
was
thing
during
to
those
include.
days and during
You're nailing it.
he
Why are we
made
talking
that
about Orwell and about when we're getting into Iraq?
statement. The anti-war movement itself also went silent once German bombs started falling on
Oh,
London,
crazy. I
at least
wonder
in
why.
Britain. Here are students in Berkeley protesting for peace with Hitler in 1940.
Uh-huh.
Probably not something they mention a lot on campus these days. The public debate around military conflict and responsibility in a conflict mostly goes into one singular direction. That being that if a military intervention fails or is built on faulty justifications, those who command it will be held to account.
No, they
However,
won't.
if a military intervention succeeds,
No, not in America. The Bosnian War, yes. Well, they actually committed genocide there. I mean, we did bring war criminals to justice for the most, like not like all of them. There was definitely once that we let fall through the cracks purposely because they're like, you once you get to a certain tier of operator, you're allowed to do war crimes without impunity.
That's true.
But like, there's some really bad war crimes in the Iraq War that besides the Abu Ghraib incident, there's other stuff. Like, there's this really brutal one. I think it was the Marines that did it, where it was this like there was a 7-year-old girl, and this guy convinced like 3 other Marines to go along with it to go rape this girl. These 4 guys,
Right.
but they killed her whole family when they did it. Right.
Awesome.
And I think they broke the mom's arms and legs.
Mm-hmm.
And then burned the house down, and then they went to
Epic.
get chicken wings after.
Awesome.
Right,
What a perfect post-rape and massacre meal. Chicken
Mhm.
wings. Excellent.
She's either 7 or 14, but
Mhm.
it's a notorious war crime in Iraq that nobody talks about.
or is built on a very solid justification, those who opposed it are not put in a position of responsibility. For example, Jeremy Corbyn opposed Western military intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo, including retroactively, and
Not a
even
good
goes out
source.
to eat pizza.
That's
with
because he's
people
a
who deny
fucking
that-
communist sympathizing
Not a
piece
good
of
source.
shit.
Not a good source.
Fuck
That is-
Jeremy Corbyn.
Not a good source.
His opposition is like saying
bro.
Claire Daly opposes the
Look,
invasion.
bro, he's literally saying
Like,
there was no
come on.
massacre at Aleppo. The guy he's sitting
Yeah.
with here.
Yeah.
Bosnian genocide by Serbian forces. However,
This guy is not a pacifist, right? But he's a pacifist in the same way that Claire Daly is, you know, that he's the anti-war, like the anti-war movement with Ukraine. That's not what pacifism is. You can be totally a pacifist and not be a secret Russia supporter.
will be hard-pressed to find people questioning him on this outside of the Bosnian media. Henry Kissinger is notorious for his decisions to needlessly prolong the Vietnam War and the undermining of Chilean democracy for his support of Pinochet's coup. You will, however, barely see Kissinger receive criticism or be held to account for his actions during the Bangladesh genocide of 1971.
That's true. This is I've brought this up. I talk about this all the time when we were criticizing Ziel Hawk on the 9/11 show, and I was like, even before that, I was like, because of what we did, we allowed him to commit a genocide and go nuclear. You know, like it was awful, those policies. And I didn't bring up that it was all Kissinger at the time, and I really slept on that because I should have. Even because the policy happened before Kissinger, he just accelerated his support for the ISI.
The Pakistani army murdered hundreds of thousands of people, and Kissinger gave the crimes his seal of approval through diplomatic.
So did Winston Churchill. Right? I think Winston Churchill was still alive and was like, that was good. Actually, I think Winston Churchill is another genocide against the Bangladesh people that Winston Churchill was all about. It might have been led by Winston Churchill. I don't know.
Silence and congratulating his
I'm not an expert on
Pakistani allies
Bangladesh.
on how well they supposedly managed this situation. The genocide itself didn't stop until India conducted a military intervention against the Pakistani army, something that Kissinger condemned. As much as you may wish to oppose a war or war in general, opposition to war or opposition to intervening in a war more often than not means siding with the winning side, or at least some very less than savory figures. This is not to say that domestic opposition to conflict is in itself always an intentional statement.
Wait a
of taking
second.
side.
Hold on. Did he just say that being anti-war is siding with the aggressor? Meaning that being anti-war is being pro-Russia, like we've been saying for the entire fucking
that's
time?
what I said. It's like the Orwell take, like that you can't be a pacifist. That's not true. But for the most part, he's specifically looking at. He's criticizing the anti-war movement that were specific. This guy even acknowledged it in the video. It's specifically the people who were actually pro-Hitler. They weren't actually anti-war.
Yeah.
There was everyone is anti-war. Even you're only pro-war for just a little bit, and that's before you go to war. Once you enter war, you're immediately anti-war. It's all about when does the war end? How do we achieve victory as efficiently as possible? So by default, almost nobody is pro-war.
But in many instances, it is.
Kissinger was.
The build-up to the Iraq War in 2003 was marked and marred by misinformation spread by senior figures and the leaders of the US government intent on
It was also journalists. It was also the NY Times. They were complacent in this, and that's really Jon Stewart never lets that go, but it's a really thing that's like they just let fly, that our media was huge in drumming up the Iraq War.
honoring public support for a false cause for war. There were reasonable reasons to protest military intervention, chief amongst them how the public had been misled by their
Most protested war in history.
president and his cabinet. But that protest came also with embarrassing measures, such as the Vatican inviting Saddam Hussein's only Christian minister, the Catholic Tariq Aziz, to the Vatican for prayers for peace. Tariq Aziz is the man who, under Saddam's orders, instructed the Iraqi army to murder 200,000 Kurds from 1986 to 1989. He was also instrumental in the violent suppression of Shia uprisings in 1991 and 1999, during which hundreds of thousands were killed. He is also known as the Children Thief for instituting a security program kidnapping children from Shia and Kurdish families as hostages to ensure these populations would not rebel. So not exactly a figure for peace. Which leads to a few questions in retrospect, which are barely asked about the Iraq.
And the Pope is? How many crusades does the Vatican launched? Like the Pope just the Pope prays with,
6?
the Pope sits down with like dictators and all that shit all the time. Like that's like his role as a religious leader is try to use like the power of prayer to make sure conflicts don't happen. Like I don't see any problem with that. Just because it's like but it's something that's like, whoa, you shouldn't bring that guy to the Vatican at least. But the Pope wasn't about to go to Iraq. Are you crazy?
War, but which are important. If the Bush-Cheney administration had not conjured up a threat of mass destruction that didn't exist, would the war have been justified by the
No.
brutality of the Saddam regime?
Oh my God.
Would instigating a war with the
There
If
were
they did-
WMDs.
Yes, the brutality against the Kurds, the war would have been justified. We implemented a no-fly zone. We were already in Iraq, right?
Mm.
It's just like saying that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022.
Yeah, it was
Technically, that's an
2014.
Yeah, but the point is that the way we escalated it, it should have been done after the first Gulf War. But they believed in the fucking domino theory, which has always been stupid. They believe that's why Vietnam went on so long, because they
Mhm.
believed if we left Vietnam, then everyone would become communist in the area because of domino theory. It's
Yeah.
always been terrible.
stated intention of removing a genocidal dictator
We should
rather
have.
than made-up chemical
should have.
weapons made that war more acceptable.
Did he just say
Or was it
made up
disaster?
chemical weapons? Jesus
Mhm.
fucking Christ. Holy
I
shit.
mean, they were there, but it was drummed up. It was accelerated. It was made up to the degree they were a threat. And why did they specifically? The main thing they were saying, oh, it's a big threat because if Saddam does even fall, then they could go into al-Qaeda hands, and that would be really bad too. It's like it's always that. It's always like they have big
Yeah.
weapons, and if they destabilize, then other people will get big weapons.
Disastrous planning of the war and occupation by people like Paul Brenner and its consequences the reason the war was so unacceptable? Would there have been just as many protests if the reasons for the war had remained the same, but the occupation had been less of a disaster? These are an uncomfortable set of questions, especially since the Iraq war is still fresh in our memory.
I'm confused on the framing. Okay, how could it have been acceptable going in if, like, they don't know how it was going to go at that point, right? It was as unacceptable going as it was leaving, right? The entire world was against this war from start to finish. The occupation went really, really bad, but they still were able to, like, at least turn it around, unlike the disaster that Vietnam was, because
Yeah.
they did it without military aggression, which is what Kissinger believed would work in Vietnam. This is like you just oppress them harder, daddy, and then they'll listen.
And
Even though it started because we couldn't let their kids go to school.
live with the consequences of its failures. Something we might discuss in a future video on why the Iraq war was such a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that should be addressed for this video
Al-Qaeda.
is that the United
Mainly al-Qaeda is why it was a disaster. We made up too much stuff, and we didn't do enough logistics about what al-Qaeda was going to do when we went in there, and al-Qaeda convinced us to do it largely.
States did not go to war in Iraq for oil. That's a populist
Good.
myth. Governments can't simply,
True.
through military force, take other countries' resources. At
Not only that, if we were going into there to get the oil, Iran wouldn't control it now.
least in our day and age. Countries
And that's a big side effect that I hope he brings up, is that Iran now controls the oil. That was one of the biggest, like, if we're talking about resources, bad move. It really helps Iran's economy get and power that oil.
decide themselves what they do with them. And the Iraqi government sold its oil themselves, and they sold it to the Chinese.
Yep.
Although wars for natural resources have been fought
else
throughout
would they
most of
sell it
human
to?
history, they are far
Who else would they sell it to?
America. Everyone, right?
We didn't need their oil. Saudi Arabia was the Middle Eastern
right.
contract that we have, right? So if we're getting this Middle Eastern oil, it's coming from Saudi Arabia at this point,
Yeah.
not Saddam.
Wait, so who did they sell it to then?
China.
Russia?
No, Iraq sells it to China.
You said, and who else?
Yeah, who else would they if it wasn't China? Like, of course they sell it to China.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, I misunderstood the question.
less common now in our day and age than ever before. And the war in Iraq was not a war fought for resources. The
No,
war in Iraq
true.
was fought because the Bush administration believed it could build an allied democracy in the Middle East. But instead, it created a theocracy allied to Iran.
Yep,
Ergo,
that's
the
true.
goal was not resources, but the widening of American geopolitical influence.
You could frame it this way, but you also have to remember that this big speech that Bush has, it was like the moment where you realize that America is descending into fascism, but we all were blind because of 9/11, where he's talking about the axis of evil and how he's going to take down the axis of evil. He's just like, fuck it, we're going to take out all the terrorists and all the war criminals. Fuck this. We got bombed. Now we're going to kill everyone who's evil, right? That was like the Bush doctrine in a way. So it wasn't so much about what's going to come after. They just assumed that they could do it. They had no plan to rebuild Iraq, only how to tear it down. And that was one of the biggest issues that plagued Iraq for years. And Bush did not care about the war once it was launched. nobody was even invested in the war for the longest time. They were just letting it happen and just like going about their day doing whatever the Bush admin was doing at the time that somehow was more important than the Iraq War.
Influence. And this raises another important question. Why does the United States design its foreign policy to widen its global influence? Conflicts have, to our day and age,
Leave it. Let it play.
All countries design foreign policy to expand their influence.
declined greatly. Nations seldom openly engage in conflicts with each other, known as interstate wars. Civil wars and militarized interstate disputes are now more common than open international national conflicts, as is the instigation of such to destabilize geopolitical opponents or undercut their ambitions. Outright invading another country to subsume it within your sphere of influence is rarer now than in previous centuries. The subverting of countries into your sphere of influence by other means is more common, not because it is easier, but because open violent aggression invites harsh retaliation.
Yes,
consequently, the past
illegal.
80 years have
War
been
is illegal.
dominated by either proxy wars, militarized border disputes, militant insurrections, the support of terror organizations, and
He just adds Saudi Arabia in when he said the support of terror organizations because that's funny as fuck. I think it's because Saudi Arabia is holding the
Consequently,
strings.
the past 80 years have been dominated by either proxy wars, militarized border disputes, militant insurrections, the support of terror organizations, and
That's
terrorist
hilarious.
subversions
It's
or
also an
starting
ISIS ball.
insurrections. This,
Yeah.
nonetheless, leaves us within a world
I
of
love
conflicts.
this though. This is like Hezbollah and Iraqi Hezbollah
Yeah.
over here with Iran. I love that. That's cool.
Interesting. And in this world of conflict, the United States is not the only actor with ambitions. In public conversations
Every
in Western
country.
democracies
Every
about
country has
international politics
ambition.
and interventions, the activities of outside actors with their own interests and ambitions are often ignored. One
What?
should never forget that in a debate about how one wants to engage on the international stage, that others also
I need to check when this was made. 3 years ago. Okay, I'll allow it.
engage on the international stage, and that naively hoping that those others may have
We didn't
your
have good
own
policy
best
3 years
interests
ago.
at heart will most likely not work. How can nations engage in a world of conflicts? Neutrality is, of course, an option to take in a world of conflict, but many people confuse neutrality with pacifism. Switzerland is the most neutral there is, and it is not some sort of pacifist mountain paradise, but practically a fortress. Up until the 2000s, all border crossing bridges into the country were laced with explosives, so the army could at any moment destroy all entry points into the country. Mountains are littered with bunkers and artillery positions. Every man must serve a year in the army, and the country has one of the best equipped and expensive militaries in Europe. Staying neutral in conflict means above all
That's because Switzerland is the only country in Europe that realizes they're in Europe and they can't leave. You know, they're like, we're in Europe. These people suck. You know, like it's a country above the rest of the region.
standing
And that's why it was
alone.
in the American
Having
deal.
no enemies also means having no friends, which means having lots of potential enemies, for which you have to prepare. Countries that maintain neutrality more often than not have some of the most well-trained and expansive militaries in their neighborhood, allowing them to feel safe in that neighborhood. Neutrality is also not a lack of aggression. During World War II, the Swiss shot down both German and American planes that violated their airspace. Neutrality doesn't just mean remaining out of conflict, it means seeing everyone as a potential threat to yourself and preparing for such. Because neutral countries that don't get Belgiumed. What might seem the most pacifist position at first is to not have an army at all, and 22 countries go that way, not having any army whatsoever. However, this comes with considerable sacrifice and might not seem as great as it may seem at first. Many of these countries are micronations with no strategic value, if nobody watches it.
That's the main thing I was going to say. When we talk about these nations, they're basically nations that nobody lives in, so they're dependent on somebody else for their protection.
Cares about you, that means nobody will care if you don't have an army. And if someone does take an interest in you, the maximum costs you can inflict on an outsider are too small to deter action. Monaco annoyed France with being a tax haven for the wealthy French for a very long time. When Monaco refused to open its banking secrets of French citizens to French authorities, the French just blockaded the armyless micronation until it did. All the Caribbean and Central American nations without militaries are without army, as they are in the American sphere of influence, the most important of which is Panama, with its canal. If anyone were to ever mess with that canal, even if it's the Panamanians themselves, that strategic interest will draw the big guy into conflict. The other Caribbeans without army also have the inconvenience of security dependency. In its history, the United States engaged in both foreign policy approaches for its first 200 years, neutrality and limitations of force. It remained in a Jeffersonian policy of not engaging in foreign conflict.
Also, our policy was that if Europeans came to this side of the world, we will kill them. That's what the policy was.
Nice.
It was more of like, these are our territories for us to exploit. That's the most thing, but we can make it in our anti-European context and frame it as like Europeans were just that bad that even ex-Europeans don't want them over here. And that's, look at the Italians. That's a great example. Like the whole country came over here and everyone, now look at America's ruined.
Conflicts and alliances remaining out of foreign wars,
You
but also
famously
established a
said
navy to
that the name Fredo
Yeah.
was like the N-word for Italians.
Yes, that was a mistake.
protect its own shores. Ground forces were for most used in internal conflicts and expansions. US foreign involvement increased in the late 1800s, not intent to create an empire or to spread its way of life, but to open new markets for its products, a central drive for American.
Okay, well, everyone was in imperialism in the late 1800s. Okay, United States is not unique, but the main thing that we would criticize here is the Philippine War.
Foreign policy. Then World War I. When the US for the first time engaged in a foreign conflict with the expressed interest of spreading its way of life, demanding decolonization and democracy from both allies and defeated, the efforts by its president were shut down, not from abroad, but internally through opposition to such a policy. The United States shut itself out again and re-engaged.
And this is like, think about this, like we saw it with, we sided against France. So the fact that like NATO exists now, because it got built up from the Cold War, actually goes against a lot of our values. Because realistically, the country we should have the most problems with is something like France. Because where they try to frame like America as the imperial ones and not Europe. Like they'll feel like, yeah, America has colonies. Look at like Guam and stuff. It's like, no, they can technically kind of leave at any time. They just have to leave the right way to avoid incident.
Engaged in a policy of neutrality, with a large navy to defend what was only hers, and then World War II. It was at this time that a series of events that pushed the United
And also the whole the British Empire, the reason it expanded was because it had a large navy. The reason they built that navy is because merchant ships were being attacked, right? So a big reason of the United States getting into World War I is that Germany kept bombing our fucking merchant ships. So yes, we built a navy because we started needing to protect our boats the same way, but it didn't lead to like us trying to get around to India or something.
United States into a more aggressive foreign policy occurred. Because as the US was absent as a backer of democracy in the world collapsed into tyranny, and that tyranny eventually came knocking down its door.
Why would we back democracy elsewhere? I mean, look what happened in the French Revolution.
Post-war 1950s, the Americans positioned themselves as the arsenal of democracy to stem the spread of totalitarianism. Post-war politicians in the United States saw the biggest lesson to be learned out of the Second World War, that foreign dictators had to be crushed before they could gain enough power to threaten the United States.
Okay.
However, that post-war foreign policy came with a heavy emphasis on defeating one specific ideology rather than spreading its own way of life.
Mm-hmm.
You can also...
We've never given a fuck about democracy. We say we do, but we don't. It's this common thing that the leaders will say here, but we don't. We don't care. When we say it's about defending democracy, we're talking about our homeland, not like making sure Israel is run democratically. It's everything to protect number one, us. NATO exists to protect shipping routes, not the United States.
If you're lucky, be Iceland. geopolitically so insignificant that nobody will ever care for you.
Wait.
This means you
Wait. Wasn't there like a big incident with Iceland? Isn't that one of the things that one of the people?
I'm pretty sure the British tried to fight them over fish. I think Germany did try and go into Iceland, and they basically said fine, and then fucking basically insurrection.
I don't know. Something did happen with Iceland around World War II. That's all I remember.
don't need an army, and you don't have to worry about anyone trying to take over from abroad. At least until climate change makes you important enough to care about. There are several countries that are geographically shaped in a way that makes it close to impossible to conquer them without chewing your teeth out in the process. Two countries that have that benefit happen to have once been at war with each other: Vietnam and the United States. Both are undesirable enemies in conflict. Both share geographical features, making them both hard.
It wasn't so much. He didn't want to invade, I don't think. Hitler didn't want to invade because he was obsessed with Iceland because of the Nordic culture and his esoteric fascist sort of bullshit. And Ava Braun went there, and then the British invaded, trying to kill her.
So this whole thing with Vietnam, like you could argue that it was the environment and the jungle environment that was the big factor that lost here. Napoleon technically kind of beat Russia, but then it was like him leaving in the cold that killed him, not the direct combat. So America couldn't even beat these guys in combat, right? It wasn't just the environment, but it was above and everything else. It was America being stupid as fuck because they assumed that these were just like ragtag rebels that they could just push over, right? They weren't thinking about that they just overthrew the French here. Because they're thinking, the French, they're easy. That doesn't mean these guys are battle-hardened people
they also
with a decade of experience that they're going to fight conscripts.
They also ignored the fact that they kind of had this white supremacist idea that because they weren't white, they're inferior as well. That was kind of a thing too.
Oh, well, yeah, sure. I'm not sure how much that built into it. I think it was more of like they weren't outwardly racist. It's like that, like it's more of like they were judging their culture, like because like they like ate rats or something. You know, it would be stuff like that. It's like a cultural shame type more thing where they're like, oh, they do something different than us, they're inferior. It's not like they think it's the skull shape type racial genetics that the Nazis had. It's more like casual racism, I would say.
Yeah,
but it's mostly that they're stupid because they didn't think that these people just beat the French, that they would be fine, and they're just going to be like
hard to conquer. But only one has a global reach. It was during and after that war that both these countries learned that the best guarantor for stability are friendships or alliances. Barely any American allies would join them in their Southeast Asian adventure, leaving them stranded with a close to...
Yeah, because it was a bad war to get involved with, and America shouldn't have done it either. And then it was like, you should have just left. Like, oh God, LBJ was bad.
Impossible task, which taught the Americans the value of allies and the disadvantages of unilateral action. The Vietnamese had many allies supporting them in ending that American adventure. But once the Americans were gone, those allies sought out influence over Vietnam through force themselves. Yeah. With Vietnam having that big bully neighbor, it also learned...
there? That's awesome.
Look, there's little Vietnamese rice farmers down here.
Over Vietnam through force themselves. With Vietnam having that big bully neighbor, it also learned the value of friendship.
Also, look, like, just
with Vietnam.
Quick, just looking at this map, I just want to remind you, like I said, where you criticize America is right here. During that late 1800s.
Absolutely.
Right? And Vietnam is right there. Like the Philippines, if we're going to say America had a colonial ambition, it's this island right next to Vietnam. You start to see why it wasn't that crazy that America got pulled in there after the French.
Also, Taiwan ball based.
Oh, yeah. Look at this one up here. What's this? Is this Nepal? No, well, it might be.
That's Thailand. The stripes is Thailand.
Yeah, this is
must
Thailand,
be Burma.
Laos, Cambodia.
It must be Burma.
I didn't know that was their flag. Because I like the Myanmar flag.
That big bully neighbor, it also learned the value of friendship. which curiously led to those two countries who fought one of the bloodiest and most vicious conflicts of history becoming friends. In a world of conflicts,
I mean, if you think about it, when you fight somebody you have beef with, normally you're cool after. Like in reality too. Also, it's like we side with the British. Like British are our friends, and like look what we did to them. Germany we're really close with. Japan we're really close with.
best way of surviving and ensuring your ability to stay independent is by allying yourself against common foes. Or if you wish to grow your influence, ally yourself to spread your influence. Alliances can be formed based on common ideology. However, if anyone ever steps out of line, that results in eternal conflicts. The world's largest military alliance in human history was not based on common ideology, but unified against a common enemy. The Western Alliance, with its American leadership, wasn't really all that Western. It contained defensive pacts with more than 60 countries, contained 25% of the world's population and 75% of the global economy, from South Korea to Pakistan to Saudi Arabia, Israel and Argentina, with NATO at its core. This was a bundle of nations that weren't ideologically aligned in anything.
Huh? Why is it?
Why is Israel a box?
Oh, it's a glass house.
I
I think that's what the joke is.
Some of them even hated or went to war with each other despite being supposedly on the same side. But they all were united in one commonality. They were all opposed to Soviet communism, which resulted in weird and
I don't know if it was they were opposed to Soviet communism as much as they were opposed to be invaded by the Soviet Union specifically. It's not so much the ideology that they didn't want. It's more of the invader. I mean, Vietnam is communist, China is communist, and they still have the relationship there because they have China as neighbors.
tangled networks of military assistance, such as the United States sending Israeli weapons to the Pakistani government to arm Saudi fanatics in a war against the Soviet Union. However, when Soviet communism came to its end, the alliance lost the one thing that kept it glued together: the enemy. This produced an American sphere of influence with no unified purpose. The American presence, once seen as a protector, increasingly started to be seen as an American occupation abroad, and as entanglement.
Oh boy, here we go. We're getting into the myth of why al-Qaeda did 9/11. He's walking right into it. Suddenly, I like normally they build it all the way back from the 70s. Like that other guy built it when we were like allied with Syria. Like here we go. This is when it happens. The fall of the Cold War is when the Middle Eastern nations realize, no, dude, no.
Foreign conflicts at home. These entanglements, compounded by conflicts within that sphere of influence, the lack of commonality in ideology and purpose, and the eventual attack against the main guarantor of the alliance from within supposed allies, became increasingly unpopular.
Yeah, dude, they did it because of NATO. Great conclusion.
The United States has had close military ties with Pakistan since the 1950s, as Pakistan's rival India was closely tied to the Soviet Union. But as the Cold War ground itself to an end, that relationship...
We literally, like, were trying to, like, sanction Ziel-Haq. Like, we hated him. We wanted him out so bad, and we're forced into dealing with him because of the Soviet invasion. Like, we were acknowledging, like, how bad he was. Because he's calling for Sharia law at this point and doing interviews with, like, you know, CNN talking about how he's going to cut thieves' hands off and stuff.
Was that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan?
Yeah, so this is the general who committed the genocide in Bangladesh, right? Terrible guy.
It became somewhat strenuous. Pakistan aided terrorist groups such as the Taliban even as they were fighting the Americans, secretly built a nuclear weapons program with the help of one of America's biggest rivals, harbored and provided safety to the enemies of the United States, and used military aid given to them to train terror groups that were sent to undermine a neighboring democratic society. All of it while...
Even the correct terrorist group down here, it's called something. Kashmir.
It remained a dictatorial Islamist theocracy. The network of allied nations built to coordinate a common effort against a common enemy turned into an entanglement of conflicting interests, ideologies, and ambition.
Bringing up Pakistan there, like just to like kind of tie it back to like 9/11 is weird because they're not in the web of alliances. We were literally helping them under the table. That was the whole, like, they weren't part of the alliance. The whole thing about like Pakistan being friendly and stuff, like, it never was. That's why Joe Biden doesn't even answer the phone calls from them. We could give a fuck about Pakistan.
Britain was the predominant global superpower for 2 centuries, and that
British
power
Free
was
Zone.
built on the reach of its
No, they weren't. No, the Ottomans. The Ottomans were way more powerful than the British during this time. This is fucking no.
global navy. To
Anglophile.
secure that position,
They definitely had the strongest navy.
Anglophiles.
They had the strongest
Anglophile.
navy, and they were the
Yeah.
most expanded because of that navy. Because the Ottomans didn't need to expand, but the Ottoman Empire was huge.
Britain had to ensure that nobody else would ever build a navy that could rival its own. Britain did so by shaping alliances of common interest, chief among them with its once adversary France. France had different reasons for its conflicts with Russia, Japan, and Germany, but its interests aligned itself with the interests of Britain, consequently creating an alliance that would shape the coming centuries. And by the dawn of the 20th century, that alliance had evolved from being held together by common interest to being held together by a common commitment and agreement to protect democracy in Europe. Finding common interests and aligning geopolitical ambitions are the main reason many nations remain in a military alliance.
This is when he uses the prince as a billboard. This is that meeting.
To the United States. As long as the United States needs Saudi oil, it
There
will
it-
ally
there it is,
itself with the
there it is,
Saudis
there's the
against its
billboard.
He's
adversaries.
so
The Saudis,
unhappy.
for their part, will not pacify the situation themselves because with the backing of the United
And like I said, this is 3 years ago, so I'm gonna let it go because this conflict has definitely evolved.
States military, they have no incentive to find a peace that also appeases the Iranians. And consequently, that
What? This is the Cole. This is the fucking al-Qaeda attack on the Cole. Why? The United States, the best thing for them is to get to a point where like Iran is not involving them in their bullshit, and they need to do it because of the relationship with Israel. They need to also make sure Iran doesn't fuck with Israel, right? So it's like literally, it's Saudi Arabia growing more distance from America and being cool with Iran is literally what America wants. They're like, oh my god, we can get the fuck out of the Middle East.
conflict the Americans find themselves currently hoisted into is a conflict solely driven by geopolitical interests, instead of a commonality in values, which are non-existent.
Yeah.
This process by which nations are roped into each other's conflicts through systems of geopolitical alliances that result in provocations and
I mean, the whole reason they're in Saudi Arabia is they're there because of the oil in Saudi Arabia, though. And like the only thing, it's Kuwait that it was going to affect the global oil price, so we deployed it. It's not like that. You're building it.
conflicts that draw a wider set of nations into conflict by making foreign conflicts their conflicts and thereby escalating conflicts is known as entanglement theory. There is, however, another way. The most
I think anything that includes the word theory in, you should just throw in the trash.
Discard it. Yep. Get rid
Stop
of it.
using it. Get rid
See you
of it.
later.
No, we don't need it.
successful alliances
I mean, political wise.
are those that transcend mere geopolitical ambition. Turkey may have recently formed a
This is the
military
best. This is the best clip. I always do this where I'll change the subtitles where I'll say, "Of course, I'm your date." But the way these,
you showed
the
me.
way they eat these ice creams is so funny in this video.
pact with Russia, but everyone knows they both intend to backstab each other at some point. The question merely is who will stab first. At the core of the Western alliance sat NATO, and its agreement was simple. An attack against one is an
Turkey and America backstab each other constantly. They're not allies. They're in an alliance. They're not allies though, or friends. They're in an alliance. Right? Like we literally are funding people they consider that is their version of al-Qaeda, but it's mainly through racism and not because like they did a 9/11 on them. Even though the PKK was super successful last year.
an attack against all. Members must be democratic, and members must be willing to contribute to the security of the
Well, that's just
Euro-Atlantic
not true.
area. The last
What? Members of NATO have to be
They have to be
democracies?
democratic.
To join.
Ah, right.
There's no measures to kick people out when they become dictatorships after. So they make the conditions to join strict, and I think that's a very good beneficial thing.
It is good. Yeah.
And it's funny that it was made in response to communism, and it changed into this like especially the Balkan collapse, like it changed into this thing where it's security within Europe, where we can finally get that violent continent under control.
part means that all NATO members are required to spend a minimum of 2% of their annual
And none of them do.
budget on military spending for armed forces to protect the wider geopolitical interests of the alliance. Far from being a constraint,
Oh, because French owns this down here. I was like, whoa, what is this South American territory? Oh, that's right. The French still have colonies.
forces to protect the wider geopolitical interests of the alliance. Far from being a constraint, this acts as a loophole, breaking entanglement in what is called freedom of action theory. Within an alliance, putting terms and conditions on how much, on what conditions, and to what extent military.
This is another theory that you need to throw out because it's the main argument of diplomacy through arms sales, which, is my area, is understanding why arms transfers happen. And Joe Biden himself will tell you that you're a fucking idiot for believing this. He says that there is some influence that you can do. To get into NATO, we see people like really, really changing, especially they're like, okay, we're applying because Russia is becoming a threat to us now. That's a big thing to a degree, but come on, look at Hungary. We can't control people through magical theories and systems.
Assistance is lent, detangles global powers from an overstretched geopolitical web while maintaining a wide deterrence network. For effective alliances, one requires effective allies. Alliances that rely on ineffective partners, thereby putting more strain on the main power of such, are more
This is so accurate right here.
likely to fail. However, NATO is
Ben Laden knew the Saudi army was inept. That's why he wasn't using them to overthrow Saddam.
everything but a detangled alliance. Only 11 countries meet the 2% NATO spending limit. Many have armed forces that are ineffective or in poor state. And some NATO members
Germany
don't even have any armed forces. In the wake of the end of the Cold War, many NATO members slacked behind in their commitment, thereby furthering the entanglement of the United States by forcing it into having to come up at its own cost for the military deficiencies of others.
Yeah.
If you ever wondered why US military
But that's the thing. That's where Europe has them by the balls. Because what is America going to do? Let Europe descend into war again? Like, they literally are holding a gun to their heads, just being like, we'll do it, man.
spending is so high, it has a lot to do with the fact that it has to jump in for allies who themselves do not stick to their commitments. An international military presence that should be partially staffed by others is consequently staffed by Americans at their own cost.
Yeah,
In a
well,
political
than
environment
Europeans.
dominated by cheap slogans and buzzwords, what is overlooked is that this time of ours is a period of post-Cold War entanglement, de-entanglement, possible new entanglement, old entanglements, revitalized geopolitical ambitions, new geopolitical ambitions, and attempts at revitalizing common interests. The flexing of
It's
international
hurting me
muscle
physically.
by
I'm not
various
kidding.
actors
I
has
have
not
eye
simply
strain.
gone away. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, in many ways, Russia inherited the geopolitical ambitions of the Soviet
Because like that's how he started his conclusion. I have no idea what the fuck he just said. So it's literally 20 minutes. Normally it takes other creators 10 minutes to build up, to waste my time in the last 3 minutes. So like this build up, it's just explaining weird ones, like explaining Pakistan, blah 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 blah, American foreign policy, blah blah blah. And then it's like, oh, entangle this, entangle that, this, that, this, that, this, that, this, that. Like, oh, God.
Union. Neither has the fact
I have
disappeared
no
that these
clue.
interests conflict with not merely the economic but also the security
It's just
interests
running
of
around in
others, and
circles.
even spread ideological systems in conflict with others. The questions that Americans, but also Europeans and increasingly Australians, Japanese, and Koreans will face is
It's
over
upside
how
down.
they
That's
come
funny.
to common interests in that environment. As much as retreat, neutrality, and isolationism may seem to be an option, it might actually be the tougher and more dangerous one. If there is to be a total disentanglement, rivals might take advantage of such. Increased entanglement to keep rivals at bay at the cost of the major powers. One can reshape into an alliance transcending geopolitical interests, united in common ground and freedom of action, which, however, might sway prior allies to leave and seek closer ties with rivals with whom they have a
come
more
on.
common commitment. In sum total, in our modern-day world of
Yeah, the Saudi are going to be like, yeah, we're going to buy Chinese weapons instead of fucking American weapons. That's going to happen, dude.
conflicts, an observation to be made is that other powers have overcome
That's the thing. It's like America's weapon industry, ironically, the military-industrial complex, it does so much for America. Another reason why Dwight D. Eisenhower was wrong, even though that's not what he was talking about, but that's what people think he was talking about. Our weapons are so good that people are like, we don't want the fucking Chinese guns. They don't have to be democratic to get our weapons, right? Because there's your competition can only get you so far.
Yeah.
But
the
like,
threat matrix as well.
we don't have to worry about Saudi Arabia turning against us and going to China for weapons.
Come the post-Cold War era to establish themselves
India
and
goes
re-establish
plays both sides, for
themselves
example.
in pursuit of clear goals, while the winners of the Cold War spent too much time in a self-congratulatory post-Cold War comfort zone.
Okay,
When they
hang
were
on.
violently turned out of it, they
Well,
found themselves
What? Winner of the Cold War. I never looked at the Cold War as something that one side lost and one side won. I just saw it as it ending because the Soviet Union collapsed, you know?
The people lost. Let's be real.
Yeah, but it's not like that was like a W for us.
No.
We were just there. Technically, we were trying to prevent the Soviet Union from collapsing at that time. That was our main policy.
themselves trapped in an international entanglement of contradictions from which they have yet to find the
This is the dumbest proxy 9/11 video I think that I've seen so far because he's like keeps tying it in with like some Cold War entanglement bit. I don't know what he's
future.
getting at.
Which path they
Cold
will
War's over,
take
my dude.
is yet to be formulated, and something that some within this audience will possibly even vote on in the future.
What?
As I finished making this video, I realized that I forgot to make an outro, which I hope you will forgive me. I will now do with a little less effort.
Okay.
Never.
20 minutes of filler, 2 minutes of content. This is what the YouTube algorithm is doing to us. You know, they're producing videos that just waste your time. Fortunately, because we exist, we now made this video not a waste of time. Go us.
Yay, us.
Beat down all the black and tans. Oh, God.